can chat about it together, but it's different for everybody. All right, hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are covering lab lesson number 6. This is the last lesson that we're covering before our lab midterm exam. So as we are diving into our content here from lesson number 6, we're going to start with a little bit of review. This review is we're gonna look at these two tissues here. My tissue I see over here on the left, this kind of tissue is one of the tissues that I find in the skeletal system, which is what we're talking about today. Can you help me out in the chat? Which kind of tissue do I see in my picture here on the left? Which kind of tissue is there on the left? Yes, exactly. Several of us typing. So what we see over here on the left is a close-up, zoomed-in view of compact bone connective tissue. You have seen compact bone before. It may have even been on your quiz this week or last week. When we talk about compact bone, the way that you recognize this one is it kind of looks like it has tree rings to it, if you will. So you always see these larger black spots, and then you're going to see rings of cells that are around those black spots. Please take a moment to sketch this in your lab packet, because in addition to being able to identify this tissue, we also need to be able to identify some of the features on this tissue. So when I look at compact bone connective tissue, one of the first things that I see, and I'm going to do my best to label for you in my terrible writing, those big black spots that you see when we're looking at compact bone, these are called central canals. So I'm going to abbreviate here, central canals. Central canals are where, if this bone tissue was alive, we would find blood vessels. So all of the big black spots that you see on compact bone, which there are lots of them on typical compact bone, these are called the central canals. Central canals where blood vessels go into and out of the bone tissue. Making those tree rings around the central canal are these other spots that we see here. These are the smaller spots. The smaller spots are called lacuna. Lacuna. Now, what I want you to write for yourself, underneath or next to the word lacuna, I want you to write that a lacuna is a home. So when we talk about bone tissue, there are a couple of different types of cells in bone tissue. Does anyone happen to remember the kind that we talked about in lab a couple weeks ago? What was that special name of the bone cells? The cells found in bone tissue. Does anyone remember? I'm making you type a lot, I know. I apologize. Exactly. Yes. So several of us are chiming in. When we talk about bone tissue, the name of the cells in bone tissue are osteocytes. That's a regular bone cell. We'll talk about a couple other kinds in lecture in a couple of weeks, but in lab, the kind of bone cell we care about are osteocytes. These are the bone cells that live inside lacuna, or open spaces that are essentially homes. When you're a bone cell and you live in compact bone connective tissue, all of the blood supply comes from this central canal that's here in the middle. But the problem is, if I am an osteocyte and I live all the way out here, that's really far away from my food here in the middle. That's why I need these little stringy lines that we see right here, or you see some more of them. We see them all over the place. All these little trails that are coming between those lacuna. All of those little lines are things that we call canaliculi. Canaliculi. Think of canaliculi as little central canals. If the blood with its nutrients and its oxygen is only in the central canal, this is the way that we share nutrients from the middle of the bone tissue all the way to the outside of the bone tissue. So in compact bone, we have the central canals, the big black spots, the lacuna, the little black spots, and those little stringy lines called canaliculi that connect them to each other, that allow the nutrients to pass through compact bone. Over here on the right, we have our other kind of bone tissue. Which kind of bone tissue do we see on the right? What's the name of that other kind of bone tissue? Exactly. Yeah, several of us chiming in. The other kind of bone tissue that I have in the body is called spongy bone tissue. Spongy bone tissue gets its name because it has open spaces like a sponge. So when I'm looking at spongy bone, this pink part right here, this is the bone tissue. And around the bone tissue, all of this stuff we see here that has the spots that are pink, or if you remember from in class together, some of my slides had dark purple spots. All of this stuff out here is bone marrow. So bone marrow here on the outside. The bone tissue itself is the solid pink stuff. When we're in spongy bone, the name of the solid pink stuff is called trabeculae. Trabeculae, little beams or little fingers, trabeculae. Now, we don't ask you to label it, but I'll mention, because this will matter in lecture in a couple of weeks. Here are the little spots that are like those spots we saw in the compact bone. So see all these things with the light purple spots? These are still those things called lacuna. These are still the homes for my bone cells, for my osteocytes, the lacuna. So we also have those in spongy bone tissue. Again, like I mentioned, I'm not going to make you label those in lab, but we will talk about in lecture how anytime I have an osteocyte, a bone cell, I will always have a lacuna, a home for it. Any questions about bone histology? Or if you're tracking with me, give me a thumbs up. Bone histology. Okay, got some thumbs up, some smiley faces. All right, so we're going to transition then from looking at the tissues into looking at a model that would show me my compact bone tissue up close and personal. So on the next page of your lab packet, you have some models that look like this. There's two different pictures of this. We are looking at compact bone. Right now I'm looking at my compact bone model from the upper part. I'm gonna go ahead and put my pointer back on. So I'm looking at my compact bone model from the top down. So this looks a lot like the tissue that we just looked at. Now we're seeing it in model form. So let's label some things together on this compact bone model. So let's start with these spaces here where you see red and blue. The spaces where we see red and blue, we've got blood vessels in there. On my model, you can see those blood vessels. So when we were looking at these on the tissue that was the bone, these were big black spots. What was the name of those black spots in the bone tissue? What are these things called? Where I can see those blood vessels. I turn it black, actually. That'll see better. Right here, here, all these guys. All of these. Yeah, exactly. Several of us chiming in. All of the places where you see those blood vessels are called the central canals. The central canals. Remember, that's the place where the blood supply goes into the bone tissue, the central canals. So where you see blood vessels, that's a central canal. Around those central canals, we can see the little brown things. So see these little light brown spots that I see in these places? These light brown spots that we see in these places, these are those homes for the osteocytes. I know it's not an English word, but do we remember what the name of the home was? Or those small black spots that we saw on compact bone? My bone cell homes. Exactly. Yep, my bone cell homes are called lacuna. So any of the places on the model where you see those little brown spots, all of those are lacuna. Compact bone tissue, tons and tons of cells. We could say that this one's a lacuna. We could say that this one's a lacuna. We could say that, you know, these ones we labeled are lacuna. Any of the light brown spots are lacuna. When we're looking at compact bone from this view, we also see a special arrangement that those lacuna, that those homes go in. So let me type here for us in the chat what they're called. They're called lamellae. Think of the word lamellae like line. So I put my bone cells in lines called lamellae. Just like we arrange our houses along streets, that's the way that the bone cells go as well. So when I'm looking at my model here, see how there's kind of, oops, get my marker going, kind of a little circle of cells right here. And then we've got a circle of cells right here. These circles of cells that we see are what we call concentric lamellae. I'm going to put it in the chat for us here. Concentric lamellae. So I'm going to abbreviate over here on my slide. Concentric lamellae. That word concentric means that we are in a circle. So concentric lamellae are the circles of bone cells that we find around the central canals. Let me color in here my central canal. The concentric lamellae around the central canal. So we'd have them over here as well. We have a little line of cells, another little line of cells. It's not perfect, right? But it's these lines of cells that we see around the central canal. Yeah, exactly right. Amush is mentioning that this is like the tree ring patterns. So concentric lamellae do make those tree ring patterns. Danae asked if the name is kind of similar to when we talked about the lamellar corpuscles. That is actually an awesome question. I don't know for sure that is correct, but I suspect you're onto something. That like I can't confirm that you're right, but I think you're right. When we talked about the lamellar corpuscles, do you remember from lab last week for all my friends? Those were the things that were deep down in the hypodermis, where they had all those layers of fat wrapping around them, kind of in circles. We're seeing the same kind of thing, circles here around our central canals. So yeah, maybe that lamellae word has something to do with circles. I love that. Great connection to make. I'm not sure if the number of concentric lamellae tells us the age of the bone like it does in a tree. We are actually constantly rebuilding your bone. So to some extent, we remake our lamellae, not as regularly as we rebuild the spongy bone, because that's easier to remodel. But we do change our concentric lamellae in our bone tissue as well. So it's probably not quite one-to-one like those tree rings are, put it that way. So we have concentric lamellae anytime we're around a central canal, but we also have some lines of bone cells that we see out here that are not making those circles around a central canal. They're just on the outside of the bone tissue. The ones that we see on the outside of the bone tissue are, I'm typing it in here, they're called circumferential lamellae. Circumferential lamellae. So the circumference of something is on the outside of it. Circumferential lamellae. Some of my lines of bone cells that make up the very outside of the bone arrange in layers on the outside to make the bone strong. That's the lines of bone cells on the outside, the circumferential lamellae, circumferential. And the ones that are in those circles are called concentric lamellae. If I live on the very outside and I don't have a central canal, I need blood supply from somewhere. And that's what this structure out here is an example of for me. This is where blood supply goes to my bone tissue on the outside. This is a thing called the periosteum. So I'm going to type the whole name in the chat, the periosteum. That's the connective tissue on the very outside of my bone, the periosteum. I believe the only thing that we have left to label are osteons. So to help us label an osteon, I'm going to put a little word math here in the chat. An osteon is made out of a central canal plus all of its concentric lamellae. Here comes the words for you. An osteon is a central canal, the blood vessels, plus all of the lines of cells that we find around it. In my picture, I have a bunch of osteons. So this right here, how we have a central canal in the middle, and then we have these lines of cells around them, that's one osteon. When I have this one that we labeled up here, a central canal with its concentric lamellae, that's another osteon. I've got osteons all over the place in this tissue. We can also see this section that's sticking up. This section over here is another example of an osteon because you can see the central canal in the middle and then all these lines, all these lamellae of the bone cells there. So osteons only seen in compact bone because we have to have a central canal and those concentric lamellae that we find around it. How do we feel about this model, looking at it from the top? We'll go to the side in just a moment. But how do we feel from the top down on compact bone? Well, I got one thumbs up. Perfect. Got some smiles too. Awesome. Okay. Well, let's switch then to our other view. We're looking at the same model, but now we're on the side. When we're on the side, you can see that weird thing that was sticking up. We can see it a lot better, maybe have some more detail on it now. This was what we called the osteon. So I like to joke, the little wedding cake over here, that's an osteon. Remember that an osteon in the middle has the blood vessels, and then we have each of those rows of the concentric lamellae. So the lines that are a circle around the central canals. More than labeling the central canal at the top of the wedding cake, where it's better to label the central canals in this view, are any of these lines that go straight down. And you can actually see in this one right here, they left the blood vessels inside. So the central canals are where the blood vessels go up and down into the bone tissue. But if you notice from my picture here, there are also some things that go sideways in my bone tissue. So see this area right here, and we see down here as well, and we see it over here. When I am talking about a way that blood moves inside bone tissue and it's going at an angle, this is called a perforating canal. A perforating canal. Perforating canals are when blood travels at an angle. Central canals is when blood goes straight up and down. Perforating canals and central canals. Notice in this picture, again, we can see that gray connective tissue on the outside called the periosteum. The periosteum. That's where some of those blood vessels come from outside the bone tissue into the central canal. We can also see a bunch of lacuna all over the place, all these little spots. Remind me again, when I talk about lacuna, what was the easy word I told you to think of with lacuna? What's the easy word for lacuna? Exactly. Yeah, several of us typing in for me. When we talk about lacuna, we're talking about those homes for our cells. So the lacuna are the little spots where we'd find the bone cells, the osteocytes. When we talk about the lines that we find them in, we call those the lamellae, the lines. Can you remind me in the chat, are there anything left for us to label on this one? I don't have my lab manual open right now. Do we need to label those circumferential lamellae? Or are we all set? No. Okay. So that should be it then. When you're studying bone tissue, know how to identify things both on the slides as well as here on the models. We can expect questions from both of those fronts. Let me see. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the different types of bones that we have in the body. Can anyone help me out with which page of your lab packet lists things like long bone, short bone? I'm losing my words. My coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Okay, page 2. Thank you. So we have 4 different structural classifications of bone in the body, and then we have one that's named based on its location. So I'm going to use the hands here to kind of give us an example of some of the types of the bones that we have in the body. So we're going to start with describing these bones based on their shape. So let's start with the types of bones like we see, let me change colors because we're black and white. The bones like we see right here. Notice how this bone is longer than it is wide. When we talk about bones in the body that are longer than they are wide, these are called long bones. We have long bones all over the place in the body. So we're seeing them here in the palm of your hand. You also see them in like your forearm or in the upper part of your arm, in your legs. Long bones are just any bone that is longer than it is wide. Some bones are about as wide as they are tall, like I see right here. If I am about as wide as I am tall, I'm called a short bone. Honestly, the most common places to find short bones are going to be your carpals and your tarsals. Can you help me out in the chat? When I'm talking about the carpal bones, where in the body are the carpal bones? Where are the carpal bones found? Yeah, exactly. Several of us are mentioning carpal bones found in the wrist. We're looking at the carpal bones right now. Tarsal bones are not in the wrist. Where are the tarsal bones found? Where's the tarsal region? Let's put it in regional terms. The tarsals. Exactly. Yep. The tarsals are the bones that make up your ankle joint. The carpals are the bones that make up your wrist joint. These two places are the best examples of where I would find short bones. Long bones, short bones. We have another kind of bone in the body. It's not seen in this picture, but we have another kind of bone in the body that is very flat or very compact. This kind of bone is called a flat bone. So a good example of a flat bone is the ribs. So when you think about the ribs, they're really skinny. The thing with flat bones is because they're so skinny, they usually curve on the edges. So your ribs are an example of a flat bone. We also have bones that are called irregular bones. Irregular bones are kind of fun because if it's not a long bone and it's not a short bone, it's not a flat bone, it's probably an irregular bone. So if you're looking at a particular bone in the body that has a bunch of different shapes on it, that would be an example of an irregular bone. So some of the bones that are irregular are things like the vertebrae or things like the scapula. If it's a bone and it doesn't work to call it short or long or flat, then it's probably an irregular bone. There is one other kind of bone that we do see in this picture here. That kind of bone is what we see right here. This is something called a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bones are not named based on their shape. They're named based on their location. So sesamoid bones are always found embedded inside tendons. So we have one really large sesamoid bone in our knee. What is the name of the sesamoid bone that everyone's got in their knee? What is the name of that kneecap? That's our normal person word for it, the kneecap. Exactly. Yep, my kneecap bone that's embedded inside the patellar tendon is called the patella. All of us have a patella. Everybody's got that. All of us also have other little sesamoid bones in random places. So the most common random places for us to have sesamoid bones are like we see here in the palms of the hands, or also in the soles of the feet. Sesamoid bones form from repeated use of something. So I like to joke that this x-ray must be from someone who's a gamer who like gets paid to play video games all day, which that's the life, right? I wish I was a professional gamer. Using his thumb a whole bunch or using her thumb a whole bunch can lead to the development of a tiny bone there. So inside the tendons of the palms of your hands, you probably have some little tiny bones. Same deal, the tendons of the soles of your feet. Those little tiny bones in those tendons are called sesamoid bones. That's all the classifications, correct? Again, I am paying for not having my lab worksheet in front of me. Perfect. Okay. So now that we've talked about the words for all of these bones, we're going to apply this to some of the bones that are listed in your lab packet. So I'm going to show you pictures of some particular bones, and we're going to work on classifying them. So the first bone that I have a picture of for you right here, this is a bone called the humerus. I'm going to go back to a regular, actually I'm going to point. This is a bone called the humerus. For your information, the way that we know this is the humerus is because this part of it right here is called the head. So the head of the humerus is really close to the shaft of the humerus. And then we go down here into the end of the humerus. When I talk about the humerus, I can classify this one based on its shape. What do we think the classification of the humerus bone is? What kind of bone is the humerus? We had long, short, flat, irregular, sesamoid. Yeah, several of us are classifying this as a long bone accurately. I liked our classification of this as the funny bone. I like it. Not fun story. Yesterday, okay, so backtrack. Let's give this full story here. I got my kids this thing called the stair slide. So it's little pieces that we put on the stairs and it makes a slide inside our house for them to go up and down. And so they love it, but we have to have a yoga mat on the floor because we have laminate on the floor. So Dr. Ollis's not fun story is yesterday I was walking across the yoga mat moved and Dr. Ollis hit her funny bone. It was not funny, but I hit it. So that makes me chuckle when we're talking about our funny bone as its classification. Love it. It is the humerus after all. Okay, so this bone is longer than it is wide. That is a long bone. The humerus, a typical long bone. Yeah, a couple of us saying stair slide sounds like fun. It's very much fun. My kids love it. Yeah, and Laura asked if it hurt yesterday. Absolutely. Let's just say that Dr. Ollis slept on the other side of her body last night. I could not sleep on my right side, but I'm doing much better today. So that's a win. I'll take it. All right, first bone, the humerus. We said that's a long bone. Second bone we're looking at is something called proximal phalanx number 4. That is a big, long name. Proximal phalanx number 4. When we talk about phalanx, that is the single word for phalanges. Where did we find the phalanges again? Where are the phalanges in the body? Or the phalangeal region? We should know it either way. Yeah, exactly. When we talk phalanges, we're talking fingers. So your fingers, from where they connect to the palm of your hand all the way out, all of this is the phalangeal region. All of these are phalanges. We will learn more about this a few weeks after the midterm when we start learning more specifically the names of particular bones. But all of these, including the thumb bones here, all of these are called phalanges. And Diana's totally right. What else is called phalanges are your toe bones, your little tiny toe bones. So all of these bones are phalanges. If they all have the same name, we have to have a way to name them. So the first way we name them is based on how close they are to the palm, to the attachment point. So we've got up here the proximal phalanges. We've got out here the distal phalanges, and here we have the middle phalanges. So this is one of them that's really close to the attachment site. It's a proximal phalanx. And we say it's number 4 because we start with the thumb, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Proximal phalanx number 4 is where a ring goes. If you're wearing a ring on your ring finger, it's on top of proximal phalanx number 4. When I look at this bone, based on those definitions, what might the classification of this bone be? What do we think? Long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. Any thoughts based on those definitions? Yeah, so you all picked up on Dr. Ollis being sneaky. So this is an example of a long bone. It's not crazy long like the humerus, but it is longer than it is wide. So a bone that is longer than it is wide, that's considered a long bone. Even this little guy out here, the little tiny end of your pinky, even that is a long bone because it's longer than it is wide. So long bones don't have to be huge. A lot of them are, but they're not all huge, longer than they're wide. Can anyone tell from the picture what bone I might have popped up now? It's kind of funky looking, but I wonder if we can figure out where in the body this might have been. Can anyone tell what that is? Exactly. Yeah, several of us chiming in. This is a picture of the sternum, or the way that the sternal region was described, right? The central breastbone. So when we look at the sternum's really skinny, or it's really thin. What was my structural classification for things that are really, really skinny or really thin? What did we call that kind of bone? Yeah, so this is an example of flat bone. And I mentioned for you the ribs are another flat bone. When we talk about flat bones, they tend to kind of curve. So when we are back together in the lab, we'll look at our skeleton models. The sternum actually kind of curves up, so it's kind of out in this region, and it's kind of back down on the two regions there. So the sternum, an example of a flat bone, it's very skinny, but it also curves at the two edges. Hey, here's my other really big long bone in the body. This is the femur. And again, I told you that the femur, the way I identified this one was because of the head, how it's so close right here. The femur has a much farther away head. We actually have a part right here called the neck of the femur. So if the head is sticking out really far, that's the femur. If the head is really close, that's the humerus. I see a question in the chat about the scapula, why the scapula is not considered irregular. Because here, I'll come back to this one right here, but right here is a picture of what an irregular bone looks like. So when we talk about an irregular bone, notice how this has a flat part right here, and we've got a part that's about as tall as it is wide. We got some little funky projections on here. There's no one way to classify this. So this is an example of a thoracic vertebrae. That's an irregular bone, lots of different shapes. When I look over here at the sternum, the entirety of this bone is skinny. It curves a little bit, but from all directions, it's all very flat. So if the vast majority of something is one shape, then we would call it that shape. In this case, we would call this a flat bone. Just like when we look at the femur, for example, it's got some funky stuff going on up here and down here as well, but most of that bone is this really tall and skinny part. So I would call this a long bone. So look at the bone overall. If almost all of it is one particular shape, then we would say that's what it is. Over here, I can't look at any one part that's almost all of this bone, which makes this an irregular bone. I skipped this one right here. This is an example of a sesamoid bone. What was the big sesamoid bone that everyone's got again? What was that one called? Exactly. Yep. So this is what the patella looks like, the kneecap bone. This is our one example of a sesamoid bone. If I'm going to ask you about a sesamoid bone, I'm going to ask you about the patella. So the patella, my major sesamoid bone. One other bone that we ask you to identify, this is one of my carpal bones. Let me do my mnemonic here. Let's see. Sally left the party to take Cindy. Are we doing cuboid? I apologize. Again, my lab packet's not in front of me. What's the name of the last bone we had you label? Was it the capitate, the cuboid? I know it's something with a C, I think. Thank you all for your patience with me. The trapezoid. Oh my gosh, Dr. Ollis needs to take another nap today. Apologies, I counted the wrong direction. So trapezoid over here. Trapezoid is one of my my carpal bones. Hey, I'm gonna be real with y'all. This is why we have to study things repeatedly, right? Because Dr. Ollis hasn't touched carpal bones in about 4 months. So Dr. Ollis is a little bit rusty. So it's not just you who has to study, it's Dr. Ollis as well. We're in it together, right? We gotta restudy our stuff. So this is a bone down here called the trapezoid. For the sake of the midterm, you don't need to know that this particular one is the trapezoid, but you do need to know that all of my carpal bones that are inside here, all of these are an example of short bones. So everybody who lives in the carpals, everybody who lives in the tarsals, all of these are short bones. That's what we see here. Any last questions about classifying bones before we move on?
What was the mnemonic?
We will talk about that more later. I'll type it in the chat because you absolutely don't have to know it yet at this point. He left the party to take Cindy home. That's a mnemonic for the first letter of all of the bones. And again, we will cover that in depth. I believe it is week 9 or week 10 when we have to learn all the names of them. So for now, just know them as the carpals. That should be sufficient. I think what happened is I actually counted, I did the wrong direction. It looks like this is a picture of the inside of the hand. I think I was doing my mnemonic backwards. So I think that's my problem. But also my problem is Dr. Ollis needs to study. All right. That brings us to the specific regions that we find on a long bone. When we talk about long bones, the ones that are longer than they are wide, they have specific parts to them. So the first set of parts that we see on the inside and the outside are here in these brackets. So this big long part of my bone is the part of the bone known as the diaphysis. So I'm not going to write the whole thing, but write part of it here. The diaphysis. I'll type the whole word in the chat. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. It's the long part of the bone. The ends of the bone have their own name. The ends of the bone are called the epiphysis. So again, I'm just going to abbreviate here, the epiphysis. Bones have two ends. They have an end that's closer to the attachment point and an end that's farther from the attachment point. When I am talking about the proximal epiphysis, would that be closer or farther from the attachment point? The proximal epiphysis. Proximal, is that closer or farther? Yeah, several of us chiming in. That word proximal, I'm going to switch colors here. Proximal means I'm closer to the attachment site. So on a long bone, that's going to be the head of the femur or the head of the humerus. The end of the bone that goes to the joint that attaches us to the body. The other end, if it's not proximal, it's distal. Remember, distal means far away. So we've got the distal epiphysis and the proximal epiphysis. These are the two ends of the bone. By the way, I remember that because the word end starts with E and epiphysis starts with E as well. On the outside of a long bone, that's all you can see, these big regions. When we go to the inside of the long bone, we can also see an open space in the middle of the diaphysis. So this region here in the middle of the diaphysis, this is something called the medullary cavity. Medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is the space inside the long bone where bone marrow is found. So the place in your body where we keep most of our bone marrow is inside these long bones. So there's actually an indentation or an open space in the middle of the bone called the medullary cavity. We also have to label on our picture of the inside where we find the different kinds of bone tissue. So I included for you on the slide here a picture of those two types of bone tissue. When I'm looking at the type of bone tissue that's over here on the left, here's my compact bone, right? This is my compact bone. Compact bone, remember we identified it with these big dark circles that we see here. Remind me if you can, what was the name of the big dark circles? In the middle of those tree rings, what were the big dark spots in compact bone? Those big ones. Yeah, it's a battle of the typing, right? It's a lot to type. The dark black spots are the central canals. Absolutely. So we've got the central canals that we can see. We can see those lacuna, those homes that we see in that bone tissue. When we talk about compact bone tissue, the hard bone tissue, we see that on the outside of our bone. So anywhere on the outside of your bone where you can see this kind of thicker layer of bone tissue, all of that is where the compact bone is. The compact bone is on the outside, making the bone smooth, making the bone tough. On the inside though, see this region up here where you can see these little open spots? Or same deal here, or we even see them down here when you look up close, all these little spots. That's where I'd find that spongy bone. So spongy bone, connective tissue, primarily found inside those end regions of the bone. Compact bone found on the outside of the bone. So different kinds of bone tissue found in different regions of our long bone. Any questions about long bone regions? Or give me a thumbs up if we're feeling okay about this. All right, I feel like I've lost about half of you, at least. We need to take a quick emoji break. So in the chat, shoot me an emoji or a GIF related to anything. I don't care. It can be how you're feeling, how you wish you were feeling, what you wish you were doing. I'm going to look for one too. Let's see if I can find you something here. Let's all send in a GIF for each other. Lighten the mood. This is my wish I was here. Dr. Ollis's GIF. Oh, Laura, are you sick? Laura sent me an emoji with a long nose. Yeah, needing a coffee refill. I feel that. Yep, Lom wants to be in bed. Me too. Let's do it. Just tired. Okay, that's better, Laura. I'm glad you're just tired. So Liza, is there anything in particular that you're feeling lost about that I can try to clear up for you before we move on? Or maybe I see your comment that you're actually good. You just wanted to send that one in. Yes, just mind blowing. I get it. Yep. All right, well, I just have one more thing that I need to talk with you about during our lab session here today, and then I'm going to give you some time to work on the group work. The last thing I'm going to talk with you about to get you ready for our midterm next week is I'm going to talk with you about the kinds of words that we use to name bone markings. So starting week 8 in lab, and I'll start getting those packets available for you, you're going to notice that there are a bunch of bone markings that we're learning. Right now, we've just learned the names of bones. We've learned where they're found. We've learned how to classify them. We're going to start learning the names of the bumps on them or their indentations or things like that. To help us get ready to do that in the second half of the semester, we're going to start by learning the general meaning of the different bone marking words that we're going to see next semester. If we can learn them in groups, that's going to help us when we start seeing specific examples on our models to know what kind of thing we're looking for. So can you help me out in the chat? Which page do we see this femur on? Can anyone tell me? It's toward the very end of the lab packet. Okay, so we're on page number 4. We have a picture of the femur. On the left, the picture that you're seeing of the femur has some labels for you. These labels are in normal English words. We like normal English words, right? Because they make sense to us. On the right, you have a blank femur with arrows pointing to the exact same spots, but instead of putting our normal nice English words on them, we're going to start putting some of our weird anatomy words on them. Now, I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you hear me when I say this. On the exam, I promise you, I am not going to ask you, where is the greater trochanter on the femur? I promise I'm not going to ask that on the midterm. I'll ask that on the final, but not on the midterm. With this activity that we're going to go through and work on together here, the goal is not for you to learn where any of these bone markings are. The goal of this activity is for you to learn, are these bone markings an example of a hole? Are they an example of an indentation? Are they something that's on the edge of a bone? Or there's a whole bunch of them that they mean something that sticks out, some kind of projection. So keep in mind, I'm going to go through and we'll do the femur together. When I'm looking at each of the fancy bone marking words, I just want to figure out by the end of this activity, does it mean a hole? Does it mean an indentation? Does it mean something that's on the edge? Or does it mean something that sticks out? So let's go back here. When I'm looking at the femur, and you have in the guided lesson for you pictures of the femur bone markings that are labeled, first thing I want to do is I want to go through and put those technical names on my different parts of the femur. So let me get my pen out and we're going to work together on this. We already talked about the name of this part of the bone earlier in our class today. Does anyone happen to remember what this part of my femur was called? Did anyone catch that? Yeah, so several of us pointing out this part up here that's sticking out is what we call the head of the femur. So the head of the femur, that's its technical name. That's not a terrible name to learn, right? You don't care though that it's called the head of the femur. Here's what you care about. I just said that this marking is the head. Notice that the bone marking word head matches up with this word projection. So if I go to page 5 in your lab packet, page 5 where we got the lists, the word head is one of my projections. I'm going to add that here to my list. Anytime I see the word head of some kind of bone, that I automatically know, okay, I'm looking for something that's a projection, something that sticks out. Okay, so we have labeled the head of the femur. My next bone marking that I have is this one up here. This is something called the greater trochanter. I'm not going to write the whole name. Greater trochanter. This one right here. Notice in my description of this structure, it says the larger bump. Oh, interesting. I've got something that's a bump. Greater means it's larger. Trochanter means a bump. Hey, so look, this bone marking down here is the smaller bump. I have a lesser trochanter, the smaller bump. So lesser trochanter. Again, I don't care about where these particular things are. I care that the word lesser is going to mean it's small, but I mostly care about this word right here. Trochanter means a bump. So I go back to page 5. Here's that word bump. I'm making a list of all of the anatomy words that means bump. And now a list I can add to here, or a word I can add to my list, is trochanter. Trochanter. That's another word that every time I see it is going to mean a bump. It's going to mean something that sticks out. Let's go back to our femur. When we talk about my line, so I've got a raised line that's in between my bumps. That's what we call the intertrochanteric crest. So this crest word means a line. A crest is a line. When we go to the bottom part of the femur, we see, let's start here with these bumps. So these bumps that we see down here are called condyles. When I talk about the femur, it has lateral and medial condyles. On the femur, this is my side that is toward the middle of the body. Would this be the location, would this side, so right here, would this be the lateral or the medial condyle? If this is the middle side of the body, is this one going to be the lateral one or the medial one? What do we think? Yeah, exactly. This is going to be my medial condyle. My bump, that's on the middle side. So this word condyle means a bump. We've got the lateral condyle over here. Again, also, condyle still, always, means a bump. Lateral condyle. Above the condyle, we have these things called epicondyles. Remember from last week how we had the epidermis that was above the dermis? The epicondyle is above the condyle. So this would be my medial epicondyle, my bump above my other bump, medial epicondyle. And I have my lateral epicondyle over here. In between those two condyles, we have this thing called the intercondylar fossa. My underline completely failed. Intercondylar fossa. That's the emphasis here, fossa. A fossa is an indentation. So the intercondylar fossa is the indentation between my condyles, between my bumps. So we've labeled some other things and didn't sort them on our list yet on page 5. Let me bump to page 5. We talked about a word that meant an indentation. Did anyone happen to catch which of our words meant some kind of indentation? Exactly. Yep, several of us caught it. So a fossa, we had that intercondylar fossa. That's the indentation between the condyles. Intercondylar fossa. We also had some words that meant a bump. What were those two words that we talked about that meant bumps? They're weird to spell, right? It's kind of mean that I ask you it this way. Sorry. Yeah, so several of us getting that first one. That first one were those condyles. We had the lateral and the medial condyles. And the other one was the thing that meant it was above a condyle. So above the condyles were the epicondyles. Epicondyles. Totally right, Amush, that my other projection is trochanter. That's absolutely right. That one was already on our list. So we got that one. Condyle, epicondyle, and notice that the other word we're putting on this list is that one that meant some kind of line. What was the name of that bone marking that was in between my trochanters? It was called the intertrochanteric, exactly, intertrochanteric crest. Crest. Okay, so let's talk about this. For the midterm exam, what I want you to know, what I want you to have memorized is the stuff we have on page 5. We've done a lot of page 5 together. We've already added some of these bone marking words to my list. That means something that sticks out. We've added a bunch of words to that list. We've added, or we've finished our list for the thing that means an indentation. You're going to use the bone markings of the skull to figure out what words go on the whole list and the edge list. I'm not going to take class time together to do that with you, but you'll do it the exact same way. So use the pictures in the guided lesson to figure out how to label each of these parts of the skull. Once you've labeled them with their technical names, look for the part that's in bold. So see how we've got angle, meatus, foramen, process. We need to figure out which of those means something on the edge, something that's a hole, something that sticks out. That's all we got to do. Figure out which words we're missing from our list. Once you've done that, flashcards. This is really good information for a flashcard. So we can make ourselves a flashcard that said words that mean some kind of hole. And on the back side, we'd have fissure, sinus, and the two other ones you're going to figure out. Another flashcard, words that mean an indentation, cavity, sulcus, notch, fossa. Or you can make them one by one. What kind of marking is a cavity? Backside, it's an indentation. What kind of marking is a fissure? It's a hole. What kind of marking is a border? It's something on the edge. We got all these guys. That means something that sticks out, a projection. The reason that you need to memorize what group these words go into is because on the midterm exam, I'm promising you that I'm going to give you a picture of several different bones with different bone markings labeled. And I'm going to ask you, hey, which of these is most likely to be the tuberosity? For you to be able to answer that question, you need to know that a tuberosity is something that sticks out and it's not a hole. or it's not an indentation. Or I'll ask you a question, hey, which of these is most likely to be a fossa? You need to know that a fossa is an indentation. It's not something that sticks out. So the last activity on our group work that we're getting ready to do here in a bit will walk you through one of these kinds of questions. I'm going to ask you about some of the bone markings on the scapula and give you a guided path to work through the questions to figure out how to answer it. So again, please do not memorize any of the stuff on page 4. Use page 4 to help you fill out page 5, which is this stuff where we're sorting the bone markings. If you know which group each of these types of bone markings go into, you are prepared for answering those kinds of questions on the exam. Before I split us into groups, do we have any questions about this or about any of the other material from today? Or shoot me an emoji to let me know that you're good.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
On the word that means bump,
Mm-hmm.
there's a total of 11. We've done up to 9, or I think might be missing one. So is that part that we have to go and find the remainder?
So there is one more projection word that you're going to find when you complete the skull labeling activity. That'll be the last one to add to your list.
Okay.
Yeah, so once you do the skull, you'll be able to fill in number 11. The skull labeling stuff will also help you to fill in the stuff that we're missing here on this page as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good question. All right, well, it looks like most of us are feeling okay about this. So let me pull up our group work activity and get that into the chat for you. Good news for lecture, for lab, I did actually make the right group work activity. So we got that. That's good for us. All right, I'm going to end the recording and post that into the chat for us.